To mark the notches and tailor tacks on the pattern, we will start with the top section of the shell pattern. Before marking the notches here at the top, we need to reduce the length of this seam line to make it the same length as the top seam line of the lining. As you remember, we reduced the size of the lining so that it would not bulge out inside the shell. We reduced the lining by 5 mm at the sides. So now we need to do the same on the shell, so that it is the same length along this seam as the lining. This will also allow the hem allowance of the shell to lie flat here inside the bag. Measure 5 mm from this corner along the seam line and mark. Repeat on this side. Now we redraw a new seam allowance line from this point to this point. Cross the seam allowance line here. Repeat on this side. We cross out the old seam allowance line here at this corner and here. Now we can mark the notches. We mark the seam lines at the top of the side seams by measuring 1.5 cm inwards. Here and here. Now mark the notch marks. Then the seam line where the shell is joined to the lining, here and here. Next, the seam line where the top section of the shell is joined to the bottom section of the shell, here, then here on this side. Now we mark here along the top hemline of the bag, here and here. We need to mark the midpoint of this section here at the top. It is 60 centimeters. Half of it is 30 centimeters. Measure 30 centimeters from this line and mark. Now indicate the notch mark with a red circle as before. We do the same down here. Measure from here to here. It is 63 centimeters. Half of it is 31.5 centimeters. Measure 31.5 centimeters from here and mark. Mark a notch here on the seam allowance line. To mark the position of the handles, we measure the distance between them. They are about 16 centimeters apart. We place our ruler here on these notch marks and mark here on the top hem line, and here on the seam line. We measure half the distance between the handles. 16 centimeters divided by 2 is 8 centimeters. Measure 8 centimeters and mark here on either side. Draw the circles to indicate the notch marks. Now we mark the Tailor tacks. We mark the Tailor tacks for the top hemline here at A using 2 different color circles. Then here at B. We need to mark in the middle along this line as well, using a Tailor's tack. We want the handle position to be marked here along the top hemline as well. So we measure and mark 8 centimeters on either side of this Tailor's tack. Mark the Tailor tacks here. Then here. We will use these Tailor tacks to form the top hemline and also to help us position the handles. To make it easier to align and sew the handles in place, we can mark between the Tailor tacks and the notches here at the bottom. Place your ruler here at the Tailor tack and the notch here at the bottom. Draw a line about the midpoint. Repeat on this side. Now using a triangle ruler, we align this edge with this Tailor's tack and this short line like this. Draw a line here. Then here on this side, intersecting the lines. Mark Tailor tacks where these lines cross, here and here. Then we mark a Tailor's tack here about 1 centimeter above the seam line. Repeat on this side. Now we mark somewhere along the midpoint on this line. These Tailor tacks will help us form the folds on the sides. Repeat on this side. Now we work on the bottom section of the shell pattern. We need to mark a notch here along the top seam line, and here on this side. Then we need a notch here in the middle. We measure this distance. It is 63 centimeters. Half of 63 centimeters is 31.5 centimeters. We need to measure 31.5 centimeters from this line and mark here. We mark the notches at the fold line as well. Since they are on a fold line, we mark them with half circles. Here, then here on this side. Now we mark the Tailor tacks for these bottom corners. Here at C, then here at D. This way we can form the fold line. We can mark more Tailor tacks in between these two to help us form this fold line on the bag. Mark somewhere in the middle between these two Tailor tacks. Now on either side, about the middle of each section. Here, and here. To help us form these two fold lines, we mark a Tailor tack somewhere in the middle of this section and here as well. Mark the Tailor tacks here then here. To help us form these triangles on the bag, we extend this line here and here. Extend the line and mark a notch here. Repeat on this side of the line. Next, we will mark the notches and Tailor tacks on the lining pattern.